Welcome, gentle souls, to mystic bedtime stories, your sanctuary for peaceful slumber and ancient wonder. I'm here to guide you on a journey that transcends the boundaries of time and space, where the mysteries of our past whisper softly into the present moment. Tonight, we venture beyond the familiar shores of the Mediterranean, past the mighty pillars of Hercules that the ancients believed marked the edge of their world, into the western reaches where sunset meets the endless Atlantic. Here, in this twilight space between history and legend, between waking and dreaming, we discover a civilization that once flourished in golden splendor, only to vanish so completely that many wonder if it ever truly existed at all. The Greeks called it Tartessos. The Phoenicians knew it as the source of silver streams and tin roads. To us, in this quiet hour, it becomes something more, a doorway to understanding how even the mightiest kingdoms eventually surrender to time's gentle tide. As you settle deeper into comfort, feel yourself drifting westward across the ancient Mediterranean. The familiar blue waters gradually shift to deeper azure, then to the gray-green of the Atlantic, where salt-laden winds carry stories from shores that existed 3,000 years ago. Your modern concerns dissolve like sea foam on distant beaches. The stress of today's world fades as you approach the mouth of a great river, the Guadalquivir, whose golden name echoes with the prosperity that once flowed along its banks. This is not merely a tale of archaeology or ancient history. This is your invitation to remember something deeper, something that resonates in the quiet chambers of your soul. For perhaps, in the mysterious way that all human stories interweave across time, you too have walked these streets, felt the Mediterranean sun warm your face, heard the rhythmic hammering of silversmiths and the distant songs of trading ships arriving from distant lands. Tonight, Mystic Bedtime Stories invites you to experience the rise and gentle fall of Tartessos, not as a distant academic subject, but as a living dream that continues to breathe in the spaces between waves, in the silence between heartbeats, in the soft transition between consciousness and sleep. The Atlantic Ocean holds its secrets differently than other seas. Where the Mediterranean cradles civilizations in its warm embrace, the Atlantic stands as a guardian of mysteries, its deeper waters harboring tales that stretch back to the very dawn of recorded time. Tonight, as evening settles over the modern world, those same waters begin to glow with the memory of ancient sunsets that painted the sky gold above a kingdom whose wealth was legend throughout the known world. Close your eyes and breathe in the salt air that carries within it the essence of 3 millennia. Feel the gentle rhythm of waves that once lapped against harbor stones, cut by hands, that knew secrets of metalworking and trade routes that stretched from the British Isles to the temples of Egypt. These are the same waves that carried silver-laden ships past the pillars of Hercules, their holds heavy with treasures that would fund Greek temples and adorn Phoenician palaces. The wind that caresses your face now whispered once through the groves of cork oak and olive trees where a people lived who called this land home long before Romans dreamed of empire, before Caesar crossed the Rubicon, before the word Spain existed in any language. They called their realm Tartessos, and for nearly 1,000 years, it stood as the western beacon of Mediterranean civilization. But Tartessos was more than a kingdom. It was a dream made manifest, a vision of what could happen when different peoples met, not with swords, but with curiosity, when wealth flowed not from conquest, but from the generous earth itself, and the patient work of skilled hands. The Phoenicians sailing from distant Tyre and Sidon found here not barbarians to be conquered, but partners in an ancient dance of commerce and culture that enriched both civilizations. Imagine, if you will, standing at the mouth of the great river where it meets the Atlantic. Behind you stretches the fertile valley of the Guadalquivir, its banks lined with settlements that specialized in arts the Greeks themselves admired. Before you extends the endless ocean, its surface broken by the triangular sails of ships whose holds carried not just goods, but ideas, technologies, and dreams between worlds. The sun hangs low on the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold that match the precious metal that made this land famous throughout the ancient world. But this gold was more than mere wealth. It was the golden light of a civilization that chose cooperation over conquest, that built its prosperity not on the suffering of others, but on the abundance of earth and sea, freely given to those wise enough to receive these gifts with gratitude. As twilight deepens, you begin to hear the whispers that the Atlantic has been carrying for 30 centuries. They speak of a time when the world was larger and smaller simultaneously. Larger because the known world ended at the Pillars of Hercules, smaller because communities were bound together by the intimate rhythms of seasons and tides, of harvest and festival, of the daily miracle of transforming raw silver into objects of such beauty that they became offerings worthy of gods. These whispers invite you now to step across the threshold of time, to walk not as a tourist in the past, but as one who remembers, however dimly, what it felt like to belong to a world where the sacred and practical intertwined as naturally as rivers flowing to the sea. The kingdom of Tartessos awaits your return, patient as the Atlantic tide, eternal as the Spanish sunset, welcoming as the harbor lights that guided ancient ships safely home. The morning mist lifts slowly from the waters of the great river, revealing a landscape so abundant that the Greeks who first heard tales of it assumed the stories must be exaggerated. But standing here now, in this liminal space between sleeping and waking, you can see for yourself the truth that made Tartessos legendary throughout the ancient world. The earth here gives up its treasures as freely as apple trees offer their fruit in autumn. Feel the soft Mediterranean breeze carrying the scent of wild rosemary and thyme across the gently rolling hills that stretch inland from the coast. These are not the harsh mountains of central Spain, but gentle slopes covered in cork oak forests and meadows where cattle graze peacefully beside streams that carry something more precious than water. The very sand of these riverbeds glints with flecks of gold, worn smooth by countless seasons of rain and snowmelt flowing down from distant peaks. Beneath your feet, the earth itself is generous beyond measure. Silver veins run through the hills like the bloodstream of some sleeping giant, so pure and plentiful that the metalworkers of Tartessos became renowned from Egypt to the Baltic Sea. The tin that Bronze Age civilization required for its most essential tools and weapons could be found here in quantities that made kings weep with envy. Lead for water pipes and roof ceiling lay close enough to the surface that children playing by streams would return home with pockets full of metal nuggets, thinking them interesting stones. But it was not merely the abundance that made this land special. It was the way the abundance was received and shared. The people of Tartessos understood something that many civilizations never learned, that wealth hoarded becomes a burden, while wealth shared becomes the foundation of lasting prosperity. The Phoenician merchants who first sailed beyond the Pillars of Hercules, expecting to establish another colonial outpost, instead found partners who welcomed trade as a form of cultural exchange. The great river that you see flowing golden in the morning light connects this western realm to the heart of the Iberian Peninsula. In the language of the people who lived here, its name meant River of Silver, And indeed, the precious metal flowed along its waters as surely as the water itself flowed toward the sea. Settlements dotted its banks like pearls on a string, each specializing in some aspect of the great work of transforming Earth's gifts into objects of beauty and utility. Walk with me along the ancient paths that connected mining settlements in the hills to workshops in the valleys, workshops to markets in the growing towns, markets to the harbors where ships from distant lands waited with holds full of goods that could not be found in Iberia. The paths themselves are paved with care, not with the brutal efficiency of Roman roads built for military conquest, but with the patient craftsmanship of people who expected these routes to serve generations yet unborn. The climate here blessed both human settlement and the work of civilization. Summers were warm but not crushing, cooled by Atlantic breezes and the shade of carefully tended groves. Winters were mild enough that outdoor work could continue through most of the year, yet cool enough that the furnaces needed for metalworking could be operated comfortably. Rain fell in its proper season, filling the rivers and streams, but rarely flooding them. This was a Goldilocks zone of climate, neither too harsh nor too gentle, demanding enough skill to create accomplished craftsmen, generous enough to reward that skill abundantly. The forests provided not just timber for construction and fuel for forges, but also the raw materials for a dozen other crafts. Cork bark was harvested in sustainable cycles that left the oak trees healthy and productive. The Burmese oak yielded both construction timber and acorns that, when properly processed, created a nutritious flour that could sustain families through any season. Olive groves, carefully tended by people who understood that such trees were investments for their great-grandchildren, produced oil that was valued as highly as precious metals in northern lands, where such luxury was unknown, and always, connecting this terrestrial abundance to the wider world, the great river flowed toward its appointment with the Atlantic. Here, where fresh water met salt water, where the known world met the mysterious ocean, natural harbors formed that could shelter ships of any size the ancient world could build. The tides that rose and fell twice daily brought not just Phoenician silver ships and Greek wine vessels, but also trading craft from lands so distant that their very names were whispered like incantations. Britain with its tin, the Baltic shores with their amber, the mysterious northern reaches where furs and whale oil waited for those brave enough to sail beyond the edge of familiar waters. As you stand on the shoreline, feeling the soft sand beneath your feet, and breathing the salt, sweet air that has carried ships safely home for 3,000 years, you begin to understand why the ancients called this the realm of gold. Not merely because precious metals could be found here, but because everything here seemed touched with the golden light of perfection, the golden mean between scarcity and excess, the golden balance that allowed a civilization to flourish without destroying the very sources of its prosperity. The sun climbs higher now, warming the stones of harbors where Phoenician captains once bargained in languages that mixed together like the waters of river and sea. You can almost hear the echoes of ancient negotiations conducted not in the harsh terms of conqueror and conquered, but in the patient cadences of people who understood that the best trades were those that left both parties feeling they had gained more than they had given. This was the secret that made Tartessos more than wealthy. It made it wise. In the gentle warmth of the rising sun, the people of Tartessos begin their daily rituals, and you find yourself moving among them like a half-remembered dream becoming real. These are not the fierce warriors of northern tribes or the austere philosophers of Greek city-states, but something altogether different, a people shaped by abundance into forms of grace that the harsher world beyond their borders could barely imagine. Their language flows like water over smooth stones, musical and fluid, with sounds that seem to echo the rhythm of waves against harbor walls. When they speak, their words carry the cadence of people who have never needed to shout to be heard, never needed to argue for their right to exist. Listen closely, and you can hear in their conversations the confidence of those who wake each morning knowing that the earth beneath their feet will provide, that the sea before them will bring gifts from distant shores, that the sky above them will offer rain in its season and sunshine in abundance. The clothing they wear tells the story of a people who have learned to transform necessity into art. The women move through the morning markets, wrapped in fabrics dyed with colors that speak of trade routes spanning continents, deep purple from the murex shells that Phoenician divers gather from Mediterranean depths, crimson from cochineal insects carefully cultivated in highland groves, and the brilliant saffron yellow that comes from the autumn harvest of crocus flowers, each thread worth more than silver in lands where such luxuries are unknown. Their garments flow with the natural grace of people who have never needed to dress for battle, who can afford the beautiful impracticality of trailing sleeves and intricate embroidery that speaks of hours spent in peaceful contemplation of pattern and design. The men wear tunics of linen so fine it seems woven from sea foam, bordered with geometric patterns that echo the designs found on their silver work and pottery. Their cloaks are fastened with brooches of gold and amber, each one a small masterpiece of the metalworker's art. But it is not ostentation you see in their dress. It is the quiet confidence of people who understand that beauty is not a luxury, but a necessity of civilized life, as essential as bread or shelter. Watch them as they move through their daily tasks, and you begin to understand how a civilization expresses its deepest values through the rhythm of ordinary life. The metalworkers rise before dawn, not because they are driven by harsh masters, but because they know the morning hours offer the clearest light for the delicate work of chasing silver into intricate patterns that will be admired in temples from Sicily to Cyprus. Their workshops ring with the patient tapping of small hammers, a percussion that blends with the sound of waves and wind to create the natural symphony of a city that has learned to make its work musical. In the potter's quarter, craftsmen shape clay with hands that have inherited techniques refined over centuries. Their vessels are not merely functional, but alive with forms that suggest the organic curves of seed pods and shells, decorated with patterns that capture the movement of water and the dance of dolphins in harbor waters. Each piece carries within it something of the spirit of this place, the understanding that even the most practical object can be a prayer of gratitude for the earth that provides the clay, the water that shapes it, the fire that transforms it. The religious life of these people flows as naturally as their daily work, for they have never learned to separate the sacred from the everyday. They honor the sun not with the fearful sacrifice of peoples who live under harsher skies, but with the grateful celebration of those who understand that each dawn brings a renewal of the covenant between heaven and earth. Their solar festivals fill the streets with music and dancing that continues from sunset to sunset, a joyous acknowledgement that the light that warms their fields and fills their harbors with favorable winds is worthy of their most beautiful expression. But it is their reverence for the sea goddess that reveals the deepest truth about these people. In temples built on promontories that overlook the meeting of river and ocean, they offer not the produce of conquest, but the fruits of partnership. Silver vessels filled with the first oil of the olive harvest, pottery painted with scenes of dolphins and fish, textiles woven with patterns that mirror the foam of breaking waves. These are offerings that speak of gratitude rather than supplication, gifts given by people who understand that the sea is not a barrier to be conquered, but a highway to be blessed. Their festivals follow the rhythm of seasons and tides, marking not just the solar year, but the lunar months that govern the movement of fish and the sailing seasons that bring traders from distant lands. During the spring equinox, young people dance in spirals that mirror the shell patterns found on their pottery, their movements creating a living mandala that connects earth and sky. In summer, when the Phoenician ships arrive heavy with goods from the eastern Mediterranean, the harbors become stages for celebrations that welcome not just trade goods, but the exchange of stories, songs, and ideas that keep their culture vibrant and growing. The autumn harvest festivals center around the grape vintage and the olive pressing, but also around the deeper mystery of transformation that their metalworkers understand so well. Just as silver ore must pass through fire to become beautiful vessels, just as grapes must ferment to become wine, they celebrate the wisdom that teaches how raw materials become art through patient skill and the blessing of time. In winter, when the Atlantic storms make long voyages dangerous and the people turn inward to their workshops and homes, they gather in the long evenings to share the stories that preserve their understanding of who they are and how they came to live in this blessed land. These are not tales of conquest and warrior glory, but stories of discovery and partnership, of ancestors who learned to read the language of metals hidden in stone, who first understood how to work with Phoenician traders as equals rather than as subordinates or masters. As you move among these people of the Western sun, you begin to feel something awakening in your own memory, a recognition that goes deeper than historical curiosity. Perhaps it is the way they move through their work with the unhurried confidence of people who trust that tomorrow will bring its own gifts. Perhaps it is the way their laughter carries over harbor waters like a blessing on the evening wind. Or perhaps it is simply the profound peace that radiates from a civilization that has learned to receive abundance with gratitude and to share prosperity with wisdom. You find yourself remembering, as if from a dream within a dream, what it felt like to wake in a world where beauty was not a rare exception, but the natural expression of daily life, where work was not a burden to be endured, but a form of worship to be celebrated, where strangers from distant lands were greeted not with suspicion, but with curiosity about the gifts they might bring and the stories they might share. The morning mist that rises from the harbor carries with it more than the salt scent of the sea. It carries whispers in languages that have not been spoken for millennia, fragments of stories that Greek travelers brought back from their journeys to the edge of the known world. As you stand in this liminal space between sleeping and waking, between history and myth, you begin to hear these ancient voices speaking of a land so wondrous that even the Greeks, who had witnessed the glory of Troy and walked among the temples of Egypt, could barely find words adequate to describe what they had seen. Herodotus, the father of history himself, sits in some distant symposium, his voice growing soft with wonder as he recounts the tales brought back by those few Greeks bold enough to sail beyond the pillars of Hercules. He speaks of a kingdom where silver flows like water and where the people live so long that a single king ruled for 8 decades, becoming more legend than man. The gathered listeners lean forward in the flickering lamplight, and you lean forward too, drawn into that ancient circle where truth and marvel dance together like shadows on a wall. Listen closely, and you can hear Herodotus speaking of Arganthonios, the silver-crowned king, whose very name has become synonymous with the abundance of this Western realm. The historian's voice carries the awe of one who has learned to distinguish between the merely improbable and the genuinely impossible, yet here he finds himself recounting a story that challenges even his careful methodology. A king who lived for 120 years, ruling for 80 of them, dying not from violence or plague, but from the simple completion of a life so full it seemed to encompass several ordinary lifespans. But the Greeks brought back more than stories of long-lived kings and silver-laden ships. They carried in their memories something that resonated with the deepest myths of their own culture, something that made them speak of this Western land in the same hushed tones they reserved for the gardens of the gods. For here, at the edge of the world, they found echoes of their most cherished legends made manifest in living stone and breathing people. The connection whispered itself to them in the evening hours when the western sky blazed with colors that seemed too vivid for mortal eyes. They had sailed beyond the Pillars of Hercules, those twin peaks that marked the boundary between the familiar Mediterranean and the mysterious Atlantic, and found themselves in the realm where their greatest hero had once walked on his final labor. For it was here, in this garden-like land where golden apples seemed to grow on every tree, and where the sunset lingered as if reluctant to leave such beauty, that Hercules had come to gather the golden apples of the Hesperides. The myth suddenly took on new meaning as these Greek visitors walked through groves where fruit trees, heavy with golden quinces and oranges, created scenes that looked like the work of divine gardeners. The Hesperides, those daughters of the evening star who were said to guard the golden apples at the world's western edge, seemed less like mythical beings and more like distant memories of the people who had learned to cultivate abundance in this blessed land. The golden apples themselves became symbols not of divine magic, but of human wisdom, the wisdom that could transform a favored landscape into something approaching paradise. But there was another connection, whispered in the corners of Greek, thought like a half-remembered dream. As these travelers described Tartessos to their compatriots back home, they found themselves using words that Plato would later use to describe his imagined Atlantis. A great island beyond the Pillars of Hercules, rich in precious metals, inhabited by people of unusual wisdom and longevity, blessed with natural harbors and fertile plains that produced abundance beyond measure. The more you listen to these ancient echoes, the more you begin to wonder whether Plato's Atlantis was not entirely a philosophical construct, but rather his attempt to understand reports that reached Athens about this real kingdom that existed at the edge of the world. The details align too perfectly to be mere coincidence. The circular harbors described in the Timaeus match the natural formation where the Guadalquivir meets the Atlantic. The abundance of metals mirrors the actual wealth that made Tartessos famous, and the eventual disappearance of Plato's Atlantis reflects the historical reality of Tartessos vanishing from the records around the 5th century before the Common Era. Stand here in the harbor as the evening light turns the water to molten gold, and you can understand how Greek sailors, accustomed to the rocky shores and wine-dark seas of their homeland, might have felt they had stumbled into a realm where mythology and geography converged. The quality of light itself seemed different here, softer and more golden, lasting longer into the evening hours and returning earlier each dawn. The very air seemed to shimmer with possibilities that more northern lands could not sustain. The Tartessians themselves contributed to this sense of living within a mythological landscape. Their own stories, shared with Greek visitors during long evenings of hospitality and cultural exchange, spoke of ancestors who had learned the secrets of metalworking from divine teachers, who had discovered the techniques of navigation from sea deities who rose from the waves to share their knowledge with mortals deemed worthy of such gifts. These were not boastful tales of conquest and domination, but gentle stories of partnership between human wisdom and divine benevolence. Greek merchants who returned season after season began to recognize in the Tartessian festivals something that reminded them of their own mystery cults, but practiced in the open air and shared freely with visitors rather than hidden in sacred enclosures and revealed only to sworn initiates. The seasonal celebrations that honored the marriage between sun and sea, between earth and sky, carried within them a wisdom that the Greeks sensed but could not quite translate into their own cultural vocabulary. As you move through this ancient landscape, you begin to understand why the Greeks found it necessary to speak of Tartessos in mythological terms. Here was a civilization that had achieved something that challenged their fundamental assumptions about the relationship between abundance and virtue, between prosperity and wisdom. In the Greek worldview, great wealth usually led to hubris and eventual divine punishment. Yet here they found a people who had sustained both material prosperity and spiritual balance for centuries, who had learned to receive abundance without being corrupted by it. The evening deepens around you, and the voices of those ancient Greek storytellers blend with the sound of waves against stones that have witnessed 3 millennia of sunsets. You realize that you are standing not just in a place that inspired myths, but in a place where the line between myth and reality becomes meaningless. The golden apples of the Hesperides are real when reality includes the wisdom to cultivate beauty, the strength to share abundance, and the grace to live in harmony with forces greater than human ambition. In this twilight space where Greek memory meets Tartessian dream, you begin to understand that some legends persist, not because they are false, but because they preserve truths too precious to be entrusted to mere historical record. The story of Tartessos lives in Greek mythology not as distortion, but as recognition, acknowledgement that some human achievements transcend the ordinary measures of success and failure to become part of the eternal story that each generation must rediscover for itself. As the stars begin to appear in the deepening sky above the harbor, you notice something that speaks to the heart of what made Tartessos truly extraordinary. The constellations visible here are not quite the same as those that shine over the eastern Mediterranean. Here at the western edge of the ancient world, new patterns emerge in the star-scattered darkness, and it was by learning to read these unfamiliar lights that the Phoenician navigators first found their way to this blessed shore. Imagine yourself standing on the deck of a Phoenician vessel as it approaches the mouth of the great river for the first time. The ship moves with the confident grace of a craft built by people who have spent centuries perfecting the marriage of wood and wind, water and human will. The hull, carved from Lebanese cedar and sealed with pitch from the Dead Sea, rides the Atlantic swells with the easy rhythm of a living thing. The sail, woven from flax grown in the Nile Delta and dyed with the precious purple that only Phoenician workshops could produce, catches the evening breeze that carries within it the scent of unknown lands. But this is not a ship of conquest cutting through hostile waters toward unwilling shores. This is a vessel of partnership, its hold filled not with weapons of war, but with treasures meant for trade. Amphorae of wine from the terraced hillsides above Tyre nestle against bolts of silk that have traveled the entire length of the Mediterranean, from workshops where techniques learned from distant Chinese artisans have been adapted to Phoenician sensibilities. Glass vessels, each one a small miracle of transparency and color, rest in carefully woven baskets alongside ingots of tin brought from mines in distant Cornwall, already worked into forms that Tartessian metalsmiths will recognize and value. The Phoenician captain who guides this floating marketplace toward its destination carries in his memory not just the navigational knowledge that has brought him safely across 1,000 miles of open ocean, but also the cultural wisdom that has made his people the great mediators of the ancient world. He understands that successful trade requires more than favorable exchange rates and quality goods. It requires the deeper alchemy that transforms strangers into partners, suspicion into trust, and mere commerce into the foundation of lasting friendship between peoples. As the ship enters the river mouth, you can feel the subtle shift that occurs when salt water begins to mix with fresh, when the deep blue of the Atlantic gradually lightens to the golden green of river water, carrying the gifts of an entire watershed toward the sea. Along both banks, settlements that have grown prosperous from this marriage of river and sea raise their evening smoke into the starlit sky. These are not fortress towns built to repel invaders, but welcoming communities that have learned to read the approach of friendly vessels by the cut of their sails and the rhythm of their oars. The greeting that echoes across the water speaks to something deeper than mere commercial hospitality. It carries the warmth of recognition, the joy of reunion between old friends whose partnership has enriched both their peoples beyond anything that conquest could achieve. Phoenician sailors call out in accented but fluent Tartessian, while harbor pilots respond in Phoenician phrases learned through seasons of profitable collaboration. This is the sound of two civilizations that have discovered how to create prosperity through cooperation rather than domination. Watch as the ship ties up at wharves built from massive stones fitted together with the precision that both peoples have brought to their crafts. Tartessian laborers work alongside Phoenician crew members to unload cargo, their movements coordinated by years of practice and mutual respect. There is laughter in their work, the easy camaraderie of people who understand that they are participating in something larger than mere economic exchange. They are creating the bonds that hold the civilized world together, the networks of trust and mutual benefit that make peace more profitable than war. The goods that flow between ship and shore tell the story of an ancient globalization built not on exploitation, but on the recognition that different lands produce different treasures, and that prosperity comes from sharing these gifts rather than hoarding them. Tartessian silver, worked into vessels so delicate they seem to capture moonlight in solid form, is exchanged for Phoenician ivory, carved with scenes of lions and palm trees that speak of African adventures. Local pottery, painted with geometric patterns that echo the movement of waves and wind, finds its way into Phoenician holds, alongside amphorae of olive oil, so pure it burns with a clean flame in temple lamps from Cyprus to Crete. But the most precious cargo flowing between these partners cannot be weighed or measured in conventional terms. It consists of ideas, techniques, and cultural innovations that travel from mind to mind like seeds carried on favorable winds. Phoenician scribes share their alphabet, that revolutionary system of writing that reduces all human speech to a handful of simple marks, while Tartessian metalworkers reveal techniques for working silver that have been refined over generations of patient experimentation. Phoenician navigators learn to read the star patterns that are visible only from these western waters, while their Tartessian hosts master the principles of deep water sailing that can carry trade beyond the sight of any shore. The workshops that line the harbor district become laboratories of cultural fusion, places where Phoenician glass-making techniques merge with Tartessian artistic sensibilities to produce vessels of unprecedented beauty. The sound that rises from these creative spaces is not the harsh noise of industrial production, but the gentle music of artisans who have learned to see their work as a form of cultural conversation, each piece carrying within it elements of both traditions transformed into something neither people could have created alone. In the evenings, when the day's trading is complete and the ships rest secure at their moorings, the two peoples gather in courtyards and taverns to share more than food and drink. Stories flow as freely as wine, tales of distant adventures and discoveries that expand everyone's understanding of how large and wonderful the world has become. Phoenician merchants tell of cities built entirely on islands, of markets where spices from India mingle with amber from the Baltic, of temples so ancient that their builders have been forgotten, but their wisdom lives on in stone. Tartessian hosts respond with stories that speak to a different kind of wonder, tales of mines that seem to replenish themselves as fast as they are worked, of trees that produce fruit year-round in this blessed climate, of techniques for working metal that were supposedly taught by sea deities who recognized the worthy hearts of human students. These are not competing mythologies, but complementary visions of a world where abundance is the natural result of wisdom rightly applied. As you move through these evening gatherings, you begin to understand that what you are witnessing represents one of humanity's great experiments in peaceful coexistence. Here, at the meeting point of river and sea, east and west, different peoples have discovered how to create wealth through collaboration rather than conquest. The Phoenicians have brought to this partnership their mastery of navigation and their networks of trade that span the known world. The Tartessians have contributed their understanding of metalwork and their genius for creating beauty from the raw materials that the earth provides so generously. The result is more than the sum of its parts, a civilization that neither people could have created alone, but both have helped to nurture into something unprecedented in the ancient world. This is not the fragile prosperity that depends on the weakness of neighbors or the exploitation of subject peoples, but the sustainable abundance that comes from recognizing that true wealth multiplies when it is shared, that security increases when it is mutual, and that the highest achievement of any civilization is not the monuments it builds to its own glory, but the partnerships it creates with other peoples in pursuit of their common flourishing. Dawn breaks gently over the greatest city of the Western world, and you find yourself walking through streets that have been planned not by military engineers or royal architects, but by generations of people who understood that a city should be like a living organism, growing naturally from the marriage of human need and natural abundance. The city of Tartessos rises from the confluence where three rivers meet the sea, its districts flowing along the waterways like petals of some enormous flower blooming at the edge of the Atlantic. The morning light reveals an urban landscape unlike anything the Mediterranean world has seen before. Where other cities huddle behind walls built for defense, Tartessos spreads confidently across its river islands and peninsulas, its boundaries determined not by military necessity, but by the natural contours of water and land. Bridges of stone and timber connect the districts, their arches reflected in waters that run clear and sweet, despite carrying the commerce of a great metropolis toward the waiting sea. Walk with me along the street of silversmiths, where the morning air already rings with the patient tapping of hammers, shaping precious metal into forms of such delicate beauty that Phoenician merchants will carry them as gifts for temples in distant lands. The workshops open directly onto the street, their craftsmen working in full view of passers-by who pause to admire techniques passed down through families for more generations than anyone can count. There is no secrecy here, no guarding of trade mysteries, for the artisans of Tartessos understand that skill freely shared becomes wisdom, while knowledge hoarded becomes mere cleverness. The silverwork emerging from these morning labors speaks to the soul of this civilization. These are not crude vessels hammered from raw metal, but objects that seem to capture the very essence of light and water in solid form. Bowls curved like shells hold shadow and gleam in perfect balance. Ceremonial cups rise like flowers from delicately worked stems, their surfaces alive with patterns that echo the flow of rivers and the dance of dolphins in harbor waters. Each piece carries within it something of the natural world that provides the raw materials, as if the craftsmen see their role not as imposing human will upon resistant matter, but as revealing the beauty that lies hidden within the earth's gifts. Beyond the metalworkers' quarter, the potter's district awakens to a different rhythm. Here, wheels turn with the steady patience of seasons, and clay takes shape under hands that have learned to think in terms of curves and volumes rather than straight lines and sharp angles. The pottery that emerges from these workshops will travel on Phoenician ships to markets throughout the Mediterranean. But it carries with it more than mere functionality. Each vessel embodies the aesthetic philosophy of a people who refuse to accept the division between beautiful and useful, who insist that even the most practical objects can be prayers of gratitude for the materials that make human life possible. The harbor district presents a spectacle that would amaze visitors from any other city of the ancient world. Where most ports are chaotic tangles of competing interests and conflicting needs, the harbor of Tartessos flows with the organized grace of a well-rehearsed dance. 3 separate harbor basins serve different aspects of the city's maritime life. The river harbor receives the flat-bottomed boats that bring silver and tin from the mining settlements upstream, their holds protected from weather by awnings woven from rushes that grow in the river shallows. The sea harbor welcomes the deep-drafted Phoenician vessels with their cargoes of exotic goods from distant shores, while the fishing harbor provides berths for the fleet of smaller craft that harvest the bounty of Atlantic waters. Connecting these 3 harbors, a system of canals and sluices manages water flow with such precision that ships can move between basins according to tides and seasons. The engineering required for such hydraulic sophistication speaks to the mathematical knowledge that Tartessian architects have developed through centuries of working with water rather than against it. This is not the brutal mastery over nature that characterizes some civilizations, but the patient partnership that comes from understanding natural forces well enough to work in harmony with them. The great market square that occupies the heart of the city tells the story of Tartessos through the goods displayed beneath colorful awnings that flutter in the morning breeze. Here, Phoenician purple cloth lies beside local textiles dyed with saffron and madder root. Egyptian papyrus shares shelf space with local writing materials made from specially prepared cork bark. Amber from the distant Baltic shores glows like captured sunlight next to native jewelry fashioned from river gold and Atlantic pearls. This is not merely commerce, but cultural conversation, each transaction carrying within it the possibility of new ideas and expanded understanding. The residential districts reveal the values of a people who have learned to create beauty without ostentation, comfort without excess. The houses rise no more than 2 or 3 stories, their flat roofs serving as gardens where families grow herbs and flowers for their own use and pleasure. Courtyards open to morning light, and evening breezes provide spaces for the daily activities that bind communities together. Children play games that teach them the skills they will need as adults, while elderly residents share the stories that preserve the wisdom accumulated over generations of prosperity and peace. Water flows through the city like lifeblood through a healthy body, carried by a network of channels and fountains that ensures every district has access to the pure mountain water that descends from the distant Sierra Morena. The fountains themselves are works of art, decorated with mosaics that celebrate the partnership between human ingenuity and natural abundance. Public baths fed by hot springs provide not just cleanliness, but social spaces where people from different districts and different backgrounds can meet as equals in the democracy of shared waters. The palace of the king rises on the highest ground of the central island, but it rises modestly, its towers and halls designed more for beauty than for defense. From its terraced gardens, which overflow with fruit trees and flowering vines, the ruler can survey not subjects to be controlled, but partners in the great work of maintaining prosperity through wisdom. The throne room opens onto courtyards where citizens can approach their king not as supplicants seeking favor, but as fellow participants in the governance of their shared homeland. But it is in the evening, when work ends and the city settles into its gentler rhythms, that you truly understand the achievement that Tartessos represents. Cooking fires bloom like flowers throughout the residential districts, their smoke rising straight in the still air before dispersing into the Atlantic sky. Music drifts from courtyards and squares where families gather for their evening meals. Not the formal music of royal courts, but the natural expressions of a people who understand that beauty belongs in daily life as surely as bread belongs on the table. As stars appear in the darkening sky, reflected in the still waters of harbors and canals, you realize that you are witnessing something unprecedented in human history. Here is a great city that has grown rich without growing violent, that has achieved power without wielding it as a weapon against its neighbors, that has created monuments not to conquest, but to the patient arts of civilization. The city of three rivers flows toward the sea with the confidence of waters that know their destination, carrying within its currents the dreams of a people who dared to imagine that abundance and virtue could not only coexist, but could strengthen and support each other through all the changing seasons of human experience. In the gentle darkness that settles over Tartessos like a blessing, you understand that some cities are built to dominate their surroundings, while others are built to celebrate them. This city has chosen celebration, and in that choice lies perhaps the secret of its enduring place in human memory, even after its stones have crumbled and its harbors have silted closed. For the true monuments of Tartessos were never built of stone and metal, but of the relationships between peoples, the knowledge shared across cultural boundaries, and the understanding that the highest purpose of human prosperity is not to elevate one group above others, but to create conditions in which all can flourish together in the garden of the world. The seasons that follow flow like a gentle river approaching unseen rapids, each year bringing subtle changes that only the most observant notice at first. You find yourself standing in the same harbor where Phoenician ships once arrived with clockwork regularity, but something in the quality of light has shifted. Something in the rhythm of the tides speaks of transformations that reach far beyond the borders of any single kingdom. The world itself is changing, and even Tartessos, for all its wisdom and prosperity, cannot remain untouched by forces that move with the inevitability of geological time. King Arganthonios sits in his palace garden, his hair now white as sea foam, his hands bearing the gentle tremor that comes to even the longest-lived mortals. In the 8 decades of his reign, he has seen the world expand beyond anything his ancestors could have imagined, watched as Phoenician trade routes stretched from the Atlantic shores to the Indian Ocean, witnessed the rise of new powers in the Eastern Mediterranean that speak of empire and dominion rather than partnership and mutual prosperity. The reports that reach him now carry undertones that disturb the evening peace he has cultivated through decades of wise governance. From the north come stories of Celtic tribes whose mastery of iron weapons has shifted the balance of power across much of Europe. These are not the bronze-working peoples with whom Tartessian merchants have traded for generations, but warriors who have learned to forge blades harder and sharper than anything the Bronze Age world could produce. Their expansion southward brings them inevitably toward the Pyrenees, that mountain barrier that has long protected the Iberian Peninsula from the conflicts that periodically convulse the northern continent. The king rises from his contemplation and walks to the window that overlooks the harbor. Below, the evening activity continues, much as it has for decades, but even here he can see the signs of change that press against the comfortable rhythms of his kingdom. Fewer Phoenician ships arrive each season, their captains speaking of piracy in the eastern Mediterranean and political upheavals that disrupt trade routes that have remained stable for centuries. The city of Carthage, once merely another Phoenician colony, has begun to speak with its own voice, asserting claims over Western trade that challenge the partnerships Tartessos has enjoyed for generations. But perhaps the most troubling changes are those that touch the natural world itself. The rains that have always come in their proper season now arrive erratically, sometimes as devastating floods that wash away carefully tended agricultural terraces, sometimes failing altogether, leaving olive groves to wither under skies that seem to have forgotten the ancient covenant between heaven and earth. The rivers that have always run clear now carry strange sediments from upstream regions where new mining techniques strip mountainsides with unprecedented efficiency, but leave scars that will take generations to heal. The silver mines that have been the foundation of Tartessian prosperity for centuries show signs of depletion that no amount of human skill can reverse. The easily accessible veins have been worked for so many generations that miners must dig deeper and travel farther to find ore of the quality that made their products famous throughout the Mediterranean world. The cost of extraction rises as the quality of metal declines, and Phoenician merchants begin to speak of alternative sources that could be developed with less expense and greater reliability. Yet it is not merely external pressures that cast shadows over the Western kingdom. Within Tartessos itself, the very success that has made the civilization remarkable begins to generate its own contradictions. Younger generations, raised in prosperity they have never had to struggle to achieve, begin to question the patient wisdom that created their abundance. Some advocate for military expansion, arguing that Tartessos should use its wealth to build armies that could secure resources and trade routes through conquest rather than negotiation. Others propose withdrawing from foreign trade altogether, turning inward to preserve their culture from the contamination of foreign ideas and influences. The king listens to these debates with the patience of one who has lived long enough to see the cyclical nature of human concerns, but also with the growing awareness that his own mortality will soon remove from the kingdom the living memory of how present prosperity was originally achieved. The institutions that have served Tartessos well were designed by people who could communicate directly with their successors, who could pass along not just laws and procedures, but the deeper understanding that animated those formal structures. How does a civilization preserve wisdom when the voices that originally articulated that wisdom fall silent? In the workshops of the artisan quarters, older craftsmen speak quietly among themselves of changes they have observed in their lifetimes. The quality of raw materials has declined as the most accessible sources are exhausted. The young apprentices, while skillful, seem more interested in innovation for its own sake than in preserving the traditional techniques that have made Tartessian silver work famous throughout the known world. Phoenician customers increasingly request pieces that imitate styles popular in the Eastern Mediterranean, rather than the distinctive designs that emerged from local traditions developed over centuries of patient refinement. The agricultural districts that surround the city present their own troubling signs. Families that have worked the same plots of land for generations report that soils that once seemed inexhaustibly fertile now require more intensive cultivation to produce the same harvests. The delicate balance between human needs and natural regeneration, maintained for centuries through practices that treated farming as a form of stewardship rather than exploitation, shows signs of strain under the pressure of feeding a growing population that expects the abundance of the past to continue automatically into the future. But perhaps the most subtle and therefore most dangerous change lies in the realm of spirit rather than material circumstance. The confidence that has always characterized Tartessian culture, the assumption that wisdom applied with patience will inevitably result in prosperity shared with justice, begins to erode under the accumulated weight of uncertainties that no amount of traditional knowledge seems adequate to address. The festivals that once celebrated the partnership between human effort and natural abundance now carry undertones of anxiety, prayers that sound more like pleading than like gratitude. King Arganthonios, now in his final years, calls together the council of elders and the representatives of the various guilds and districts that have shared in governing the kingdom. His voice, though weakened by age, still carries the authority of one who has guided his people through 8 decades of mostly peaceful prosperity. He speaks not of the threats that surround them, for those are obvious to anyone with eyes to see, but of the need to preserve something more essential than political independence or economic prosperity. We have been the guardians of an idea, he tells them, his words carrying across the council chamber like a benediction. The idea that different peoples can meet as equals, that prosperity can be shared without being diminished, that wisdom grows when it is freely given rather than jealously hoarded. This idea has made us wealthy, but more importantly, it has made us worthy of the abundance the world has granted us. Whether our kingdom survives the challenges that surround us matters less than whether this idea survives to inspire future generations who may need to rediscover these truths for themselves. As the council session ends and the representatives return to their various districts, you walk with them through streets that still glow with the warm light of prosperity, but prosperity that now carries within it the poignancy of all beautiful things that exist in time. The evening calls of vendors selling their wares, the laughter of children playing in courtyards, the music that drifts from taverns where Phoenician sailors share stories with local fishermen, all these familiar sounds now seem precious in a way they never did when they could be taken for granted. The stars that appear in the darkening sky have witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations throughout human history, and they offer no promises that any particular achievement will prove permanent. But they also testify to the enduring human capacity to create beauty, even in the knowledge that all beauty must eventually fade, to build wisely even when wisdom cannot guarantee survival, to love deeply even when love cannot prevent loss. Tonight, as you settle into the peaceful rhythms that still govern life in Tartessos, you carry within you the understanding that some things are worth preserving, not because they can last forever, but because they represent humanity at its best, reaching toward ideals that transcend the limitations of any particular time or place. The shadows that gather over the Western Kingdom are real, but so is the light they cannot extinguish. The light of human wisdom and compassion that continues to shine even when the civilizations that kindled it have passed into memory and legend. A morning comes when the harbor of Tartessos awakens to find fewer ships at anchor than anyone can remember seeing in their lifetime. The fishing boats return with their usual catch, and the river barges continue to bring goods from the interior settlements. But the great Phoenician vessels that have shaped the rhythm of seasons for centuries now arrive sporadically, their captains speaking in hushed tones of troubles that have closed familiar ports and redirected ancient trade routes toward destinations that offer greater security, if less partnership. You walk through streets that still echo with the sounds of daily life, but the echoes seem to carry farther than they once did, as if the very air has grown thinner, less able to hold the full resonance of a thriving civilization. Children still play in the courtyards, but their games seem quieter somehow. Their laughter touched with the unconscious melancholy that children absorb from the adults around them, even when those adults work hard to maintain the appearance of normalcy. In the workshops of the artisan quarters, the master craftsmen continue their patient work, but apprentices are fewer now, and some of the younger families speak of opportunities that might await them in other lands, other cities where the future seems more certain than it does here in the shadow of gathering change. The silver vessels that emerge from these diminished workshops are as beautiful as ever, perhaps more beautiful, carrying within their curves and patterns the concentrated essence of skills that may not survive another generation. King Arganthonios has passed into the realm of memory and legend, his death marking the end of an era in ways that extend far beyond the normal transition from one ruler to another. The new king, his nephew, possesses all the formal qualifications for leadership and much of the wisdom accumulated through decades of careful observation, yet he lacks something that cannot be taught or inherited: the living memory of how the partnerships that created Tartessian prosperity were originally forged. He must navigate by charts drawn by others, rather than by the direct knowledge of currents and tides that comes only from having sailed these waters through all their changing moods. The council meetings that once addressed questions of expansion and innovation now focus increasingly on preservation and adaptation. How can the kingdom maintain its essential character while adjusting to circumstances that no previous generation has had to face? How can traditions be preserved when the conditions that gave birth to those traditions no longer exist? These are questions that have no easy answers, and the very act of asking them changes the nature of the culture that poses them. Subtle signs of transformation appear everywhere for those with eyes to see them. The great market square, once crowded with goods from across the known world, now displays primarily local products, beautifully made, but speaking of a world that has grown smaller rather than larger. The multiple languages that once filled the harbor district with their musical babble now reduced to the familiar cadences of the local tongue, occasionally punctuated by the voices of visitors who come seeking the remnants of trade relationships that once spanned continents. Yet the manner of Tartessos's passing speaks to the character of the civilization itself. There are no dramatic battles, no sieges or sacks that reduce great cities to rubble in a season of violence. Instead, there is a gradual fading, like a musical note held so long that listeners become uncertain when it stops being sound and becomes memory. Families simply choose to seek their fortunes elsewhere, taking with them skills and traditions that will enrich other lands, but leaving behind workshops that grow silent one by one. Some of the population moves inland, following river valleys toward highland settlements, where the disruptions of the changing world penetrate more slowly. They carry with them the crafts and knowledge that defined their culture, but they carry it into contexts where such skills serve different purposes. where survival takes precedence over the patient pursuit of beauty for its own sake. The metalworking techniques that once created objects of pure artistry now focus on tools and weapons that can provide security in an increasingly uncertain world. Others choose to join the Phoenician diaspora, sailing eastward toward markets that still hunger for their skills, even if those markets operate according to different principles than the ones that flourished in Tartessos. These emigrants become teachers and innovators in distant lands, their influence spreading far beyond what any conquering army could have achieved. But their departure leaves behind empty spaces that echo with the ghost of what was once a complete and self-sufficient civilization. The great river continues to flow toward the sea, but it carries different burdens now. Where it once bore the prosperity of a thriving kingdom, it now transports the gradual dispersal of that kingdom's achievements. Skills and traditions, stories and songs, techniques and philosophies float along its current like seeds scattered by autumn winds, some destined to take root in distant soils, others destined to nourish the earth through their decomposition into elements that future growth can utilize. Archaeological evidence suggests that the transition occurred over decades rather than years, a slow transformation rather than a sudden catastrophe. Villages that had served as satellites to the great urban center adapted by developing more self-sufficient economies. Workshops that had specialized in luxury goods for export began producing items for local use. The complex networks that had connected Tartessos to the wider Mediterranean world simplified into more modest patterns of regional exchange. But perhaps the most mysterious aspect of Tartessos's disappearance lies not in what can be documented, but in what cannot be explained. Why did a civilization that had shown such remarkable adaptability over centuries suddenly lose its ability to adjust to new circumstances? Was it simply that the challenges of the changing world exceeded any culture's capacity for response? Or did some more subtle transformation occur? Some shift in the collective spirit that made the effort of continuation seem less compelling than the choice of graceful dissolution, standing in what was once the heart of the kingdom? You sense that multiple explanations might all be partially true without any single one capturing the full mystery. Environmental changes made traditional prosperity more difficult to sustain. Political upheavals disrupted trade relationships that had been generations in the building. Cultural transformations altered the values that had originally motivated the patient work of civilization building. Yet beneath all these practical explanations lies something more elusive, something that touches the deepest questions about why some civilizations endure while others choose to transform themselves so completely that they effectively disappear. The last written records that can be definitively attributed to Tartessian scribes speak not of despair or defeat, but of a kind of philosophical acceptance. They describe their civilization not as ending, but as completing itself, fulfilling a purpose that was always meant to be temporary. Like a musical composition that reaches its natural conclusion, or a flower that blooms magnificently before releasing its seeds to the wind, Tartessos seems to have understood its own impermanence as part of its essential nature. In the gathering dusk of a civilization, you begin to understand that some disappearances are not failures, but transformations, not defeats, but evolutions into forms that transcend the visible structures that originally contained them. The buildings of Tartessos crumble, and the harbors silt closed, but the ideas that animated this remarkable experiment in human cooperation disperse like spores on the wind, carrying within them the potential for future flowering in times and places yet to be discovered. As night settles over the landscape that once supported the Western world's most prosperous kingdom, you realize that you are witnessing not an ending, but a metamorphosis. Not a loss, but a gift offered to the future by a people wise enough to understand that the greatest achievements of any civilization lie not in what it preserves for itself, but in what it contributes to the ongoing human story that connects all peoples across the vast expanses of time and space. Centuries flow like a great river returning to the sea, carrying with them the memory of Tartessos, until only whispers remain in the writings of classical historians and the dreams of those who sense that something extraordinary once flourished at the western edge of the ancient world. The landscape that witnessed such prosperity settles into different rhythms, serving new peoples who build their own cities and pursue their own destinies, largely unaware that beneath their feet lie the foundations of a civilization that time has almost completely erased. But memory has its own persistence, independent of visible monuments or written records. In the 19th century, when European scholars begin to approach the ancient world with the systematic methods that will come to be called archaeology, certain questions arise that cannot be answered by studying the familiar ruins of Greece and Rome. Where was the Tartessos that Herodotus described with such wonder? What became of the silver-rich kingdom that Strabo claimed existed beyond the Pillars of Hercules? Could such a place have existed without leaving traces that patient investigation might still uncover? You find yourself walking alongside these early investigators as they make their way across the Andalusian landscape. Their eyes trained to read in subtle variations of soil color and vegetation patterns the signatures of human habitation buried beneath centuries of sediment and agricultural use. These are not treasure hunters seeking gold and artifacts, but something more like detectives pursuing a mystery that has haunted European scholarship since the Renaissance rediscovery of classical texts revealed the gap between what ancient sources claimed existed and what visible evidence seemed to support. The first breakthrough comes not from dramatic excavation, but from patient map-making and geographical analysis. Scholars comparing the descriptions left by ancient writers with the actual topography of southwestern Spain begin to understand that the landscape itself has changed more dramatically than anyone had imagined. The great river that the Romans called Bidus and the Arabs called Guadalquivir once followed a different course, creating a vast inland sea where today only marshlands remain. The harbor that served ancient Tartessos may lie not beneath modern cities, but beneath wetlands that flood and drain with seasonal rhythms that have continued unchanged for millennia. German archaeologist Adolf Scholten arrives in Spain at the beginning of the 20th century, carrying with him not just the tools of scientific excavation, but the romantic conviction that Tartessos represents something essential about human civilization that must not be allowed to disappear completely from memory. His expeditions into the Marismas, the marshy lowlands near the mouth of the Guadalquivir, are undertaken with the methodical patience of someone who understands that the most important discoveries often emerge from the accumulation of small details rather than from dramatic moments of revelation. Working in conditions that test the limits of human endurance, under the blazing Andalusian sun and through winters when the marshlands become nearly impassable, Scholten's teams begin to uncover evidence that ancient settlements of considerable sophistication once flourished in areas that modern eyes see only as empty wetlands. Pottery shards decorated with geometric patterns unlike anything found in other Iberian sites, fragments of metalwork showing techniques that combine local traditions with foreign influences, and most intriguingly, examples of a script that appears to be indigenous to the region, yet shows clear relationships to Phoenician writing systems. Yet for every question that these discoveries answer, they raise two more. The settlements that Schulten uncovers are significant, but are they truly the remains of the legendary Tartessos, or merely evidence of the broader cultural complex that classical writers described using that name? The dating techniques available in the early 20th century cannot provide the precision needed to establish clear chronologies, and the relationship between different sites remains tantalizingly unclear. The search takes on new dimensions as the century progresses and archaeological methods become more sophisticated. Aerial photography reveals the geometric patterns of ancient field systems preserved in areas where seasonal flooding has prevented modern agricultural development. Magnetometry detects the subsurface signatures of buried walls and foundations. Carbon dating begins to provide reliable chronologies that can connect Spanish discoveries to the broader timeline of Mediterranean civilization. But perhaps the most significant transformation in the search for Tartessos comes with the realization that what the investigators are seeking may not be a single city or even a single kingdom, but rather a network of related settlements that together created the prosperity and cultural sophistication that impressed ancient visitors. This understanding shifts the focus from the quest for a specific location to the more complex task of reconstructing an entire regional civilization that expressed itself through multiple centers connected by rivers, trade routes, and shared cultural practices. Spanish archaeologists of the late 20th century approach this challenge with advantages that their predecessors could not have imagined. Underwater archaeology reveals harbors and anchorages preserved beneath river sediments. Environmental archaeology reconstructs ancient climates and vegetation patterns that help explain how human settlement adapted to changing natural conditions. Computer modeling creates virtual reconstructions of landscapes as they appeared 3,000 years ago, allowing researchers to understand how geography shaped the development of Tartessian civilization. The discoveries that emerge from these more sophisticated investigations paint a picture that is both more complex and more fascinating than anything the early Romantic searchers could have imagined. Rather than a single urban center dominating its region, Tartessos appears to have been a confederation of settlements, each specializing in different aspects of the regional economy, but all connected by the great river system that provided both transportation and communication throughout the watershed. Gold jewelry of extraordinary sophistication emerges from burial sites scattered across the region, pieces that demonstrate not only the technical skill of local craftsmen, but also their familiarity with artistic traditions from across the Mediterranean world. Bronze cauldrons decorated with scenes that blend local mythological themes with foreign iconographic elements speak of a culture confident enough in its own identity to incorporate influences from distant sources without losing its essential character. Yet the more that is discovered about the material culture of ancient southwestern Spain, the more mysterious becomes the question of what happened to the people who created such remarkable artifacts. Unlike the ruins of classical cities, which typically show clear evidence of conquest, destruction, or gradual abandonment, the Tartessian sites seem to simply fade away, their inhabitants departing so gradually and completely that they left behind little indication of where they went or why they chose to leave. Modern researchers approach this mystery with the understanding that the disappearance of Tartessos may be less dramatic but more significant than the violent destruction that befell many ancient civilizations. Rather than being destroyed by external forces, Tartessian culture may have transformed itself so completely that it effectively became something else, its essential elements preserved but expressed through different institutions and practices that adapted to changing circumstances. As you walk with these contemporary archaeologists through landscapes that conceal 3 millennia of human history, you begin to understand that the search for Tartessos has become something more than an academic investigation. It has become a meditation on the nature of cultural continuity and change, an exploration of how human communities adapt to challenges that threaten their survival, and a recognition that the most important aspects of any civilization may be precisely those that cannot be preserved in museums or reconstructed through excavation. The evening light falls across excavation sites where patient work continues season after season, each careful brushstroke and measured drawing adding another small piece to a puzzle that may never be completely solved. Yet the incompleteness of the picture does not diminish its significance. In the fragments of pottery and corroded metal, in the traces of ancient field systems and the shadows of vanished buildings, something of the spirit that animated Tartessian civilization continues to speak to those who have learned to listen with both scientific rigor and imaginative sympathy. Standing in the gathering dusk among the reeds and waterways of the Guadalquivir Delta, you realize that the search for Tartessos has become a search for something more universal, an attempt to understand how human beings create meaning and beauty under circumstances that are always temporary, always subject to forces beyond complete control. The archaeologists who work here are not just recovering the past, but discovering resources for facing an uncertain future, learning from a people who managed to build something beautiful and enduring, even while understanding that nothing human can last forever. In the quiet moments between sleeping and waking, when the mind moves freely between what was and what might be, the wisdom of Tartessos emerges not as historical fact, but as living guidance, speaking across the centuries to hearts that hunger for the same balance between prosperity and peace that these ancient people somehow achieved. Their memory becomes a mirror in which we can examine our own choices, our own relationship with abundance, our own understanding of what it means to live well in a world that offers both gifts and challenges in measures that no individual can control. The first lesson that whispers to us from those distant shores concerns the nature of wealth itself. In our time, as in theirs, societies struggle with the question of how much is enough, how prosperity can be pursued without destroying the sources of that prosperity, how material success can be achieved without sacrificing the spiritual qualities that make such success meaningful. Tartessos seems to have discovered that true wealth lies not in accumulation, but in circulation, not in hoarding, but in sharing, not in the desperate pursuit of more, but in the grateful stewardship of what has already been given. Watch the Tartessian merchants as they negotiate with Phoenician traders, and you see something that challenges many modern assumptions about the relationship between business and ethics. These are not zero-sum transactions where one party's gain must come at the expense of the other's loss, but collaborative efforts to create value that benefits everyone involved. The silver and tin that flow from Iberian mines enrich not only those who extract and work the metals, but also the Phoenician merchants who transport them and the distant craftsmen who transform them into objects of beauty and utility. This understanding extended far beyond commercial relationships to encompass the entire network of connections that bind human communities together. Tartessian festivals celebrated not just local harvests, but the arrival of trading ships that brought news and goods from distant lands. Their prosperity was understood to be interconnected with the prosperity of their partners, creating webs of mutual dependence that made war not just morally questionable, but economically irrational. In an age when many societies built their strength on the weakness of their neighbors, Tartessos chose to build its security on the strength of its friends. The environmental wisdom embedded in Tartessian practices speaks with particular urgency to contemporary concerns about sustainability and climate change. These ancient people understood something that modern industrial civilization has had to rediscover through painful experience: that human activity must work in partnership with natural systems rather than in opposition to them. Their mining techniques extracted precious metals without devastating entire landscapes. Their agriculture produced abundance without exhausting the soil. Their cities grew without poisoning the waters that sustained them. This harmony between human need and natural capacity was not achieved through primitive technology or simple living, but through sophisticated understanding of ecological relationships that allowed for both prosperity and sustainability. Tartessian metalworkers developed techniques for recycling and reusing materials that minimized waste. Their farmers practiced crop rotation and soil management that maintained fertility across generations. Their urban planners designed cities that worked with water flow rather than against it, creating drainage and sewage systems that enhanced rather than degraded the local environment. Perhaps most significantly, the people of Tartessos seem to have understood that environmental stewardship is not a burden imposed by external authorities, but a form of enlightened self-interest that ensures the continuation of prosperity across time. They treated the earth not as a resource to be exploited, but as a partner to be respected, recognizing that human flourishing depends ultimately on the health of the natural systems that support all life. The social innovations of Tartessian culture offer insights that remain relevant to contemporary struggles with inequality, social cohesion, and cultural diversity. Here was a society that achieved remarkable prosperity without extreme concentrations of wealth, that welcomed foreign influences without losing its own identity, that maintained social order without oppressive hierarchy. The archaeological record suggests a civilization where craftsmen lived well, but kings did not live extravagantly, where social mobility was possible, but social stability was maintained. Their approach to cultural diversity offers a particularly instructive contrast to both ancient and modern alternatives. Where many societies have sought purity through exclusion or dominance through assimilation, Tartessos seems to have achieved strength through synthesis. Phoenician writing systems merged with local artistic traditions to create new forms of expression that belonged fully to neither parent culture but drew vitality from both. Religious practices incorporated foreign elements without abandoning indigenous beliefs. Technological innovations combined local materials with imported techniques to produce results that surpassed what either tradition could have achieved alone. This cultural confidence enabled Tartessian society to remain open to outside influences while maintaining its essential character, to learn from others without losing itself, to adapt to changing circumstances without sacrificing its core values. In an age when many societies faced the choice between isolation and absorption, Tartessos discovered a third path that preserved autonomy while embracing connection. The spiritual dimensions of Tartessian life speak to contemporary searches for meaning that transcend material success. Their religious practices seem to have been characterized less by fear of divine punishment than by gratitude for divine generosity, less by complicated theology than by simple recognition of the sacred in the everyday world. They honored the sun not as a harsh taskmaster demanding sacrifice, but as a generous provider offering light and warmth freely to all who needed them. They revered the sea not as a dangerous enemy to be conquered, but as a mysterious friend whose gifts made their prosperity possible. This spirituality integrated seamlessly with practical life, rather than standing apart from it as a separate domain reserved for special occasions. Work became worship when it was performed with skill and dedication. Trade became sacrament when it was conducted with honesty and generosity. Even the most mundane activities carried within them opportunities for gratitude and reverence that transformed ordinary life into continuous prayer. The political wisdom of Tartessos offers insights for contemporary struggles with governance and leadership. Their kings seem to have understood that true authority comes not from the power to compel obedience, but from the ability to inspire cooperation. Rather than ruling through fear or manipulation, they governed through example and consultation, creating institutions that channeled individual ambition toward collective benefit. Their political structures were apparently flexible enough to accommodate change while stable enough to provide continuity, democratic enough to include diverse voices, while decisive enough to take effective action. As you sit in the peaceful darkness, feeling the gentle rhythm of waves against distant shores and breathing the salt air that has carried these ancient lessons across 30 centuries, you begin to understand that the wisdom of Tartessos was never really lost. It lives wherever people choose cooperation over competition, wherever communities find ways to share prosperity rather than concentrate it, wherever human beings remember that they are part of something larger than themselves and that their individual flourishing depends on the flourishing of the whole. The specific forms that Tartessian wisdom took, the particular technologies, institutions, and practices that allowed their civilization to thrive, were products of their time and place that cannot be simply copied into different circumstances. But the principles that animated those forms remain as relevant today as they were 3,000 years ago. The understanding that true security comes from mutual aid rather than mutual threat, that genuine prosperity includes everyone or ultimately includes no one, that the health of human communities depends on the health of the natural world that sustains them. In the gentle transition between waking thought and sleeping dream, you carry with you the memory of a people who proved that human beings can create something beautiful and lasting, even in full knowledge that nothing human lasts forever, who built wisely even while understanding that all building is temporary, who loved deeply, even while accepting that all love must eventually transform into memory, and then into the eternal silence that holds all memories like stars in an infinite sky. As the boundary between sleeping and waking grows thin as morning mist, as your breathing settles into the rhythm of gentle waves against ancient shores, something stirs in the deeper chambers of memory, something that reaches beyond the history you have learned and touches the history you have lived. For in the mysterious way that all human stories interweave across the vast tapestry of time, you begin to remember that you too walked these streets when they were new, that your hands too shaped silver into beauty, that your voice too joined the evening songs that rose from courtyards where families gathered to share the day's gifts and the night's peace. Feel yourself awakening, but awakening 3,000 years ago, when the world was both smaller and larger than it is today. Smaller because the boundaries of the known stretched only as far as the fastest ships could sail in a season. Larger because every day brought the possibility of encounters with peoples whose customs and stories expanded the understanding of what it meant to be human. You wake in a house built of stones quarried from nearby hills, in a room where morning light filters through windows that frame views of harbor waters, where fishing boats return with the dawn catch and trading ships rest at anchor, their holds full of treasures from the far reaches of the world. The bed beneath you is simple but comfortable. its frame crafted from wood that grew in the cork oak forests that cover the hills behind the city. The blankets that warm you through the cool hours before dawn are woven from wool provided by sheep that graze in meadows irrigated by streams that carry mountain snowmelt toward the waiting sea. Everything in your immediate environment speaks of the intimate connection between human comfort and natural abundance, between individual well-being and the health of the larger community that makes such well-being possible. You rise and walk to the window, your feet bare against floors made from clay tiles fired in kilns that burn with wood from sustainably managed forests. Below, the city is already stirring with the quiet activity of people whose work is in harmony with the rhythms of seasons and tides. The baker, whose ovens supply your neighborhood, has been at work since before the stars faded, timing his labor so that fresh bread will be ready as households begin their morning routines. The fishermen whose boats you can see returning to harbor departed in the darkness, reading the positions of constellations to guide them to waters where experience taught them the fish would be feeding as the night gave way to day. The water you pour from the ceramic pitcher beside your bed comes from springs in the distant mountains, carried to your home by aqueducts that work with gravity and natural flow rather than against them. It tastes of the limestone caverns where it gathered its mineral clarity, of the oak and pine forests through which it flowed on its journey from sky to sea. As you drink, you participate in the same cycle that waters the olive groves and fills the rivers, that sustains all life from the smallest insects to the greatest sea creatures that visit these shores. Dressing in the tunic that marks you as a craftsperson of the Metalworkers Guild, you prepare to join the daily work that gives your life both purpose and prosperity. The garment itself tells the story of trade networks that span continents, linen grown in Egypt and shipped to Phoenician ports, dye extracted from shellfish gathered in waters near Tyre, thread spun by artisans whose techniques have been refined over generations of patient experimentation. Yet the patterns embroidered around the neckline and sleeves are distinctly local, geometric designs that echo the decorative motifs found on pottery made in workshops just across the plaza from your home. Walking through streets still cool with the memory of night, you join the flow of people beginning their daily contributions to the common prosperity. The cobblestones beneath your feet were laid by stonemasons who understood that a city's infrastructure should last for generations, who took pride in creating pathways that would serve not just their own children, but their children's children. The drainage channels that carry away the previous evening's rain were designed by engineers who studied water flow with the same careful attention that astronomers devoted to the movements of stars. Your workshop occupies the ground floor of a building shared with 3 other metalworking families, each specializing in different aspects of the complex art of transforming raw ore into objects of beauty and utility. The courtyard that provides light and ventilation for all 4 workshops also serves as a space where techniques are shared, where master craftsmen teach apprentices not just the mechanical skills of their trade, but the aesthetic philosophy that elevates mere function into art. Here, competition gives way to collaboration, secrecy to generosity, individual ambition to collective excellence. The silver you work today came from mines in the nearby hills, extracted by methods that take only what the earth offers freely, while leaving the landscape able to heal and regenerate. The ore arrived at your workshop already partially refined by techniques that waste nothing, that find uses for every byproduct of the smelting process. Even the smoke from your furnaces is channeled through chambers where it deposits materials that other craftsmen can use for different purposes, ensuring that nothing of value is lost to the sky. As your hands shape the metal, guided by skills inherited from generations of artisans and enhanced by your own innovations and insights. You participate in a form of prayer that requires no words, no formal ritual, no separation from the ordinary activities of daily life. The hammer that strikes the silver strikes in rhythm with your heartbeat, with the pulse of waves against harbor stones, with the deeper rhythms that connect all living things in patterns too vast and subtle for conscious thought to comprehend fully. The vessel that emerges from your morning's work will hold wine for celebrations, water for ceremonies, oil for lamps that illuminate evening gatherings where stories are shared and friendships deepened. But more than its practical function, it will carry within its curves and surfaces something of the spirit that animates your civilization, the understanding that beauty is not a luxury reserved for the wealthy, but a necessity that enriches every life it touches. The geometric patterns you chase into the silver's surface speak a visual language that connects your work to the broader cultural conversation that flows through poetry and music, architecture and dance, philosophy and daily conversation. At midday, when the sun reaches its zenith and the heat makes metalworking uncomfortable, you join the common meal that brings together all the residents of your neighborhood. The food spread on tables set in the shade of fruit trees includes bread made from grain grown in the river valley, oil pressed from olives cultivated on terraced hillsides, fish caught in waters that remain clean because the city's waste disposal systems work in harmony with natural purification processes. Wine aged in caves carved into limestone cliffs accompanies conversation that moves freely between practical concerns and philosophical speculation, between local news and reports from distant lands. The afternoon brings different rhythms as the workshops quiet, and people turn to activities that nourish the soul as morning labors nourished the community. Some gather in the baths that use heated spring water to create spaces for relaxation and social connection. Others visit the library, where Phoenician and local scribes preserve the accumulated wisdom of both cultures in scrolls that record everything from practical techniques to mythological stories. Still others walk in gardens designed to showcase the aesthetic possibilities that emerge when human artistry works in partnership with natural growth. As evening approaches, and the western sky begins to glow with colors that seem too vivid for any earthly palette, you join the informal procession of people making their way to the harbor to watch the sunset that marks the end of another day in paradise. Here, at the edge of the known world, where the great river meets the boundless ocean, you stand with friends and neighbors whose faces reflect the same quiet satisfaction that fills your own heart. The stars that appear as darkness deepens are the same stars that guide Phoenician navigators across waters that connect your home to distant shores. The same stars that shine over Egyptian temples and Mesopotamian ziggurats, over Celtic hill forts and Scythian burial mounds. Yet they seem to shine with special favor on this Western realm, where different peoples have learned to create prosperity through cooperation, where individual talents serve collective flourishing, where the pursuit of beauty and the pursuit of practical well-being have merged into a single, harmonious way of life. In the peace that settles over the city like a blessing, you understand that you are living through one of history's great experiments in human possibility, participating in the creation of a civilization that will inspire dreams and legends long after its physical structures have returned to the earth that provided their materials. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep in rooms perfumed with sea air and olive blossoms, you carry within you the deep satisfaction that comes from belonging to something larger than yourself. something beautiful enough to justify all the patient work required to create and maintain it. The dream that takes you as consciousness fades is not an escape from reality, but a deeper entry into it, a recognition that this moment of peace and prosperity, however temporary it may prove to be, represents humanity at its best, reaching toward ideals that remain valid even when the circumstances that originally embodied them have passed into memory and legend. The journey back to the present moment comes as gently as morning mist lifting from harbor waters, as softly as the tide returning to familiar shores after its long conversation with the deep ocean. You find yourself once again in your own time, in your own place, but carrying within you something that was not there when this journey began. The streets of ancient Tartessos fade into the realm of dreams and memory. Yet they leave behind an echo that continues to resonate in the quiet chambers of your heart. What remains is not the detailed knowledge of dates and dynasties, not the archaeological precision of pottery shards and foundation stones, but something more precious and more permanent. It is the understanding that human beings have always possessed the capacity to create beauty in the face of uncertainty, to build wisely even while knowing that all building is temporary, to love deeply even while accepting that all love must eventually transform into the eternal silence that holds all memories like stars scattered across an infinite sky. The civilization that flourished at the western edge of the ancient world may have vanished from the visible landscape, its harbors silted closed, and its palaces returned to the earth that provided their stones. Yet in vanishing, Tartessos accomplished something that conquest never could have achieved. It became part of the eternal human story, a permanent reminder that cooperation can be more powerful than competition, that wisdom can be more valuable than wealth, that the patient arts of peace can create monuments more enduring than any raised by the violent arts of war. Tonight, as you settle deeper into the peaceful rhythms of approaching sleep, you carry with you the memory of morning light on silver water, of voices raised in songs that celebrated abundance without forgetting gratitude, of hands that shaped precious metal into vessels worthy of holding both wine and dreams. These memories belong to you now, not as historical facts to be filed away in the museum of the mind, but as living possibilities that continue to whisper their gentle truths into every moment when you must choose between fear and trust, between hoarding and sharing, between the easy cynicism that protects the heart and the vulnerable wisdom that opens it to the full spectrum of human experience. The ocean that witnessed the rise and gentle transformation of Tartessos continues to breathe with the same eternal rhythm, its waves carrying messages between shores that no longer remember the names of the peoples who once traded across its distances. Yet the ocean itself remembers, holding in its vast liquid memory the echoes of all the ships that ever sailed its waters, all the dreams that ever looked toward distant horizons, all the love that ever found expression in the patient work of building something beautiful enough to justify the faith that such building requires. In the space between waking and sleeping, between remembering and dreaming, you understand that you have not been listening to a story about the distant past, but to a story about the eternal present, about the choices that every generation must make between wisdom and cleverness, between sustainable prosperity and unsustainable extraction, between the expansion of consciousness and the contraction of fear. The people of Tartessos faced challenges that were different in their specifics, but identical in their essence to the challenges that face every human community in every age: how to live well together on the earth that is our common home. Their answer echoes still in the sound of waves against shores that have outlasted all the civilizations that ever depended on their generosity. It whispers in the wind that moves through olive groves planted by hands that turned to dust millennia ago, but whose patient work continues to bear fruit for people who will never know their names. It glows in the light of stars that guided ancient navigators toward harbors that no longer exist, but whose magnetic pull still draws human hearts toward the possibility of safe arrival after long journeys through dangerous waters. As consciousness releases its hold on the day's concerns and drifts toward the healing darkness of restorative sleep, you rest in the knowledge that the greatest achievements of the human spirit cannot be destroyed by time or circumstance, cannot be conquered by armies, or erased by the forgetting of those who come after. They live on in the realm of inspiration and possibility, in the quiet places where one heart speaks to another across the vast distances that separate all souls seeking meaning in a universe too large for complete understanding, but not too large for love. The whispers of Tartessos continue in every act of generosity that creates more wealth than it expends, in every moment of cooperation that accomplishes more than competition ever could, in every choice to build something beautiful rather than something merely useful, something sustainable rather than something merely profitable, something worthy of the human spirit rather than something that diminishes it. These whispers reach you now in the gentle space between thoughts, in the peaceful interval between heartbeats, in the sacred silence that connects all breathing beings in the shared mystery of existence. Sleep comes now like a gentle tide, returning to embrace familiar shores, carrying you toward dreams that are not escapes from reality, but deeper entries into it, toward rest that is not mere absence of activity, but presence to the eternal rhythms that sustain all life, all love, all hope, across the turning seasons of time that measure mortal duration, but cannot touch the immortal longings that make even the briefest human lives partake of something infinite and imperishable. The last whisper that reaches you from the shores of that ancient kingdom speaks not of what was lost when Tartessos faded into memory, but of what was gained when its people learned to release their grip on the temporary forms through which eternal truths had found expression, allowing those truths to flow like water toward new vessels, new voices, new hearts ready to receive and embody the perennial wisdom that each generation must rediscover for itself in the language and circumstances of its own time. Rest now in the peace that comes from understanding that you too are part of this continuing story, that your own choices and dreams and acts of love contribute to the human experiment that began when the first conscious beings looked up at stars and wondered what it might mean to live worthy of the vastness that contains us all. In sleep, as in waking, the whispers remain, gentle as breath, persistent as hope, eternal as the love that calls all souls home to themselves and to each other across every distance, through every difficulty, beyond every ending toward the beginning that is always beginning again.